Next, I would like to invite and introduce Mari Inoue. Again, I'm going to share my screen. Mari Inoue was born and raised in Tokyo, Japan. While working as an immigration attorney in New York since 2001, she has been active in grassroots movements to educate policymakers and elected officials of the costs, risk, and humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons and nuclear energy. She's also a co-founding member of the Manhattan Project for a Nuclear-Free World, and we're so happy that she's here with us today.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Eileen, for the kind introduction. I'd like to share my presentation first, and after that, I'd like to share a video clip from a Fukushima mother who was heavily impacted by the Fukushima disaster. Right. Hello, everyone. My name is Mari Inoue. I'm a co-founding member of Manhattan Project for a Nuclear-Free World, which is a volunteer-led grassroots group that started 10 years ago. We promote nuclear-free policies and we collaborate with groups here in the US as well as in Japan. I'd like to start my presentation by talking about history of atomic cover-ups in Japan, which started soon after the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And soon after the bombings, the United States occupied Japan until 1952. And during this time, a strict press code was implemented and local press was banned from reporting about the atomic bombs or reality of atomic bomb survivors. The Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission, ABCC, was established by the United States in Hiroshima and Nagasaki to collect medical data of atomic bomb survivors. This is very similar to Project 4.1, which was a medical data collection/experiment against the people of the Marshall Islands. And most of the medical data of survivors was confiscated by the United States. And the ABCC was later succeeded by the Radiation Effects Research Foundation, which is now jointly operated by both the United States and Japan. The second atomic cover-up was right after the Castle Bravo nuclear testing in the Marshall Islands on March 1st, 1954, which was the largest nuclear testing in the Pacific. And one of the Japanese fishing boat, Daigo Fukuryumaru, or Lucky Dragon number 5, was heavily impacted, and one of the crew members passed away. And this ignited a large anti-nuclear movement in Japan that subsequently led to the establishment of anti-nuclear groups. However, United States and Japan entered into agreement on January 4th, 1955, and the United States agreed to pay $2 million to the Japanese government to compensate only for the damages sustained by Daigo Fukuryumaru. What people didn't know then, and what many Japanese people do not know now, is that estimated 10,000 crew members of hundreds of other Japanese fishing boats were also affected by the radioactive fallout from the testing. However, to this day, Japan and the United States both continue to deny the claims of those affected, and their voices and struggles were deliberately suppressed and erased from history. And if you're interested in learning more about this cover-up, Ms. Shimamoto talks about in details in her video message, and her video message is available on our YouTube channel. And the third atomic cover-up was soon after the January 4th, 1955 agreement between the US and Japan, and they started promoting nuclear energy as so-called atoms for peace. And they started building nuclear power plants in Japan in rural communities with limited resources, such as Fukushima. And this is another form of nuclear colonialism. They said that a nuclear energy is safe, a nuclear accident will never happen, but actually it did in March 2011. And Japan is still in a state of nuclear emergency. So what is Fukushima nuclear disaster? It happened soon after March 11, 2011, when the huge earthquake hit the northeast Japan that damaged the electricity supply to the Fukushima Daiichi's reactor's vital cooling system. And the subsequent tsunami wave then destroyed emergency backup generators. And because of that, reactor 1, reactor 2, and reactor 3 had hydrogen explosions. Reactor 4 sustained fire damage. And some 160,000 people were forced to evacuate at some point. And tens of thousands are still displaced. Nearly 300 Fukushima youth were diagnosed with thyroid cancer or suspected of having thyroid cancer. And the radioactive fallout reached to Tokyo and beyond. And now Japan plans to dump large amount of radioactive wastewater from the damaged nuclear power plant into the Pacific Ocean starting from next year. Soon after the Fukushima disaster, Japan proposed this food safety standard. They relaxed the food safety standard and implemented this 500 becquerels per kilogram standard in terms of radioactive cesium. Before the Fukushima disaster, they had this 100 becquerels per kilogram standard to distinguish radioactive waste from regular waste. So 500 becquerels per kilogram in terms of radioactive cesium means that it is okay to give radioactive waste to pregnant women, to children, to babies. And that kind of safety standard is not acceptable. So there was a huge outcry in Japanese society from human rights organizations, medical groups. And finally, a year later, Japan implemented this 100 becquerels per kilogram standard, but it took another year to fully implement this standard. Evacuation zone was established based on 30-kilometer radius from the crippled nuclear power plant. However, in the past 10 years, many districts started to lift evacuation orders. So it's getting smaller and smaller. So people began to question the Japanese government's initial radiation exposure assessment, the scope of their radioactivity measuring, and their lack of transparency. Mothers were concerned about the food safety of their children. And the graphic on the right is a radiation data map created by Minano Data Site, which is a network of dozens of people-led radioactivity measurement laboratories that were established in Fukushima and across Japan. They analyzed more than 3,400 soil samples in 17 prefectures, collected by more than 4,000 volunteers using unified sampling method. Let me briefly explain this graphic to you. So this is Japan, which is slightly smaller than the California state. At the time of the nuclear accident, there were 54 nuclear reactors, which is insane. And these dots shows the level of radioactivity in soil samples collected from 17 prefectures based on the contamination. It's color coded. This one is, the unit is becquerels per kilogram of cesium-134 and cesium-137. And as I mentioned before, pre-disaster standard of nuclear waste was 100 becquerels per kilogram. And if nuclear waste, and at that time, before the disaster, nuclear waste was supposed to be stored safely. But after the Fukushima disaster, there are so many those yellow dots. You see that 100 becquerels per kilogram is yellow dots. And you see the red dots here, even in Tokyo, which is more than 200 kilometers away from Fukushima and even beyond. So based on the calculation, Minano Data Site was able to estimate the radioactive cesium contamination over 100 years. So even from 20 years from now, you will see some red spots right here in Tokyo area. And this is where more than 20 million people live. And we have video messages from radiation measurement groups in Japan. And these are also available in YouTube channel. So now, last year, Japan announced that it will release more than 1.28 million metric tons of radioactive wastewater from the damaged Fukushima Daiichi into the Pacific Ocean, starting from next year and continuing for more than 30 years. And the graph on this right side shows, this is based on the study of Professor Aoyama. He calculated how the cesium-137 moved the Pacific Ocean in the past 10 years from Fukushima Daiichi. And he found out that cesium-137 from Fukushima Daiichi was even detected 6 years later in the north of Alaska. And it also circulated back to Japan. It took 8 years. So in regard to the Japanese dumping plan, IAEA did some assessment in 2020, and they said that they don't have technology to separate tritium, which is one of the radioactive isotope in the contaminated water. They basically said that they don't have a solution other than dumping into the ocean. Japanese government also said they admitted that tritium and carbon-14, which is another radioactive isotope, cannot be removed using their filtering system. Nonetheless, the United States and IAEA support Japan's dumping plan. On the other hand, 3 independent human rights experts appointed by the United Nations Human Rights Council expressed deep regret at Japan's decision. They said that such dumping imposes considerable risks to the full enjoyment of human rights of concerned populations in and beyond the borders of Japan, but their voices were ignored. We also submitted an open letter to Japan in June last year, which was endorsed by more than 70 US groups. We called on Japan to withdraw its dumping plan. We also reminded them that communities in the Pacific have still been living with the threats of remaining contamination exposure, decimated environments, and generational trauma from nuclear testing. I'd like to show those 2 posters. The one on the left shows the number of nuclear weapons we have in the world, and the one on the right shows the fissile material inventory, which could make additional hundreds of thousands of nuclear bombs. And as you can see, it's kind of small, but as you can see right here, Japan has more than 45 tons of separated plutonium, even though it is not a nuclear armed state. And this is a serious security threat in Northeast Asia region. In regard to the ongoing concern at Chernobyl and other nuclear facilities in Ukraine, it came to our attention that the data from the Chernobyl site recorded an exceptional jump on February 24th, soon after the Russian forces entered the site. And there was another increasing jump right here on the next day on February 25th. So we submitted a letter with about 10 civil society organizations across the world, calling on IAEA to investigate and assess whether they need to send additional nuclear technicians to maintain the safety of nuclear sites in Ukraine. We also requested IAEA to be more transparent and also request member states of the IAEA to refrain from any military or other action that could jeopardize the public safety of nuclear facility. And we submitted this letter on March 1st because we heard that an IAEA Board of Governors emergency meeting was held on March 2nd. And a couple of days later, there was a fire at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, the largest nuclear power plant in Europe. So I'd like to show these 2 graphs. Ukraine has 15 commercial nuclear reactors, in addition to decommissioned nuclear reactors at Chernobyl. And EU, there are more than 10 EU nations that have nuclear reactors. So the ongoing situation in Ukraine has taught us that IAEA does not even have a system to send a team of nuclear technicians to nuclear power plants to mitigate a nuclear emergency. I like to emphasize that nuclear is not a climate solution because damaged nuclear power plants or radioactive storage sites could result in devastating radioactive impacts in the region. We don't even need a nuclear weapon to cause the devastating impact in Europe. So we have to stop creating more radioactive waste, and we need to shut down nuclear power plants and nuclear facilities. So I like to dedicate my presentation to anti-nuclear actors in Fukushima who left us last year, Mr. Hasegawa, who was struggling with the thyroid cancer. Ms. Hitomi was struggling with the ovarian cancer. And a couple of years ago, Ms. Hitomi sent us a video clip talking about the importance of maintaining the radiation monitoring sites in Fukushima because that's the only visible safety measures for the residents. We also have testimonies of those affected by nuclear disaster in Fukushima. Thank you so much for your attention. Now I'd like to share the video clip of Fukushima mother who was affected by the Fukushima disaster.
皆さんこんにちは。双葉町出身の大森と申します。この汚染水に対する思いを伝えに今日はこの場に立ちました。今から50年以上前、今の 1F が立っている場所に私の実家がありました。すみません。原発が作られることになり、買収となり、新たに土地を求め、私の生まれ育った双葉町の実家ができました。そして今、私の双葉町の実家は中間貯蔵施設となり、ここいわきの地に移り住んでいます。この半世紀、私たち家族は5世代にわたり、もうこの問題翻弄され続けています。もうこの問題から解放させてください。汚染水を流すことは言うまでもなく反対です。もうこれ以上私たちの生まれ育った大事な場所を汚さないでください。一人一人この問題への意識がこれからの世代を担う子どもたちの未来を守ります。どうぞ皆さんよろしくお願いいたします。ありがとうございました。
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mari. There was so much in that presentation and you laid it all out so well. Thank you so much. And I just want to acknowledge that this is an issue that hits close to home for many who are presenting here today. And there's a lot of pain in these presentations because this is an issue that's impacted so many. I also want to just remind people that are watching to make sure to donate to the Minano data site, MDS, which Mari shared about their grassroots work to track radiation exposure and soil samples in Japan. Again, the links are available in the chat.